The car rolled through the iron gates before Claire Whitfield could finish taking a breath. The villa rose in front of her like something out of an old painting, stone walls glowing gold under the evening sun, and her hands would not stop shaking. Alessandro reached over and pressed his palm against hers. "You do not need to be afraid," he said quietly. "They will love you the way I love you." Claire smiled at him, but the smile did not reach her eyes. She had grown up in a small house outside Columbus, Ohio, where dinner was something you made yourself, and nobody worried about which fork to use. Now she was about to walk into a house where 3 generations of Italian nobility were waiting to look her over like a piece of furniture that did not match the room. The engagement had happened fast, too fast, according to Alessandro's mother, Contessa Vittoria Moretti Vance, who had said as much in a phone call that Claire was never supposed to hear. Alessandro had not told her that his mother's exact words were, "This girl is a mistake you will regret," but Claire had heard enough second-hand comments from friends of friends to understand the shape of things. The car stopped. A servant in a dark uniform opened her door, and Claire stepped out onto gravel that crunched under her shoes. Shoes she had bought 2 days earlier because she owned nothing that felt right for a place like this. She smoothed her dress, took one more breath, and followed Alessandro up the wide stone steps. Inside, the entrance hall stretched up 2 full floors, with a chandelier that looked like it had been hanging there since before her country existed. Portraits lined the walls, stern faces staring down at her, judging her before she had said a single word. "Alessandro," a woman's voice, cool and precise, came from the top of the staircase. Contessa Vittoria descended slowly, her silver hair pulled back into a perfect knot, her eyes moving over Claire, the way a customs officer studies a suspicious bag. "So this is her." "Mother, this is Claire," Alessandro said, his voice carrying a warning underneath the politeness. "Claire, this is my mother, Vittoria." "It's wonderful to finally meet you," Claire said, extending her hand. Vittoria looked at the hand for a moment longer than was comfortable, before taking it briefly. "Yes, wonderful." She turned and began walking toward the dining room, without another word, leaving Claire standing there, with her hand still half raised. Alessandro squeezed her shoulder. "She is like this with everyone at first." Claire did not believe him, but she nodded anyway. The dining room was already filling with relatives when they entered. Claire counted at least 15 people, all dressed as though they had stepped out of a magazine, all speaking in low, fast Italian that rolled past her like water she could not catch. She recognized none of the words, only the rhythm of a conversation happening entirely without her. A young woman near the head of the table looked up as Claire entered. She had sharp cheekbones, dark hair pulled into a low twist, and an expression that suggested she found something deeply funny that she was not sharing. This, Claire would soon learn, was Isabella, Alessandro's cousin, and the sharpest tongue in a family full of sharp tongues. "Alessandro," Isabella said in English, standing to kiss him on both cheeks. Then, switching to Italian, she said something to the woman beside her that made both of them laugh softly behind their hands. Chiara did not understand the words, but she understood the laugh. She had heard that particular kind of laugh before, back in school, back when other girls used to whisper about her second-hand clothes, in a language that was technically English, but designed so she would not quite catch every word. This felt the same, just dressed up in a foreign tongue, in an expensive dining room. She took her seat, where a place card with her name had been set, 2 chairs down from Alessandro, who had been pulled toward the head of the table by an uncle wanting to discuss business. Claire found herself sitting mostly alone, surrounded by conversations she could not enter. An older man across from her, Alessandro's great-uncle Paolo, gave her a small nod and a kind smile, the first genuine warmth she had felt since arriving. He said something in Italian, gesturing at the bread basket. Claire smiled back but had no idea what he had asked. She simply picked up a piece of bread and set it on her plate, hoping that was close enough to the right response. The dinner began. Servers brought out course after course, and around her the family talked and laughed in a language that flowed like a river she was not allowed to swim in. She caught single words here and there, words that sounded almost like English cousins, but she could not string enough of them together to follow a single sentence. "Poverina," Isabella said at one point, looking at Claire with something like pity dressed up as sympathy. The women near her tittered. Claire had no idea what the word meant. She simply kept eating, kept her back straight, kept the small, polite smile on her face that she had practiced in the mirror before leaving her hotel room that morning. Vittoria, seated at the head of the table, watched Claire with narrowed eyes throughout the meal. Occasionally, she would say something quietly to the woman beside her, a cousin named Renata, and the two of them would glance toward Claire before looking away. What none of them realized, what none of them had bothered to ask, was that Claire had spent 3 years of her life in Florence. She had gone there at 22, with a small scholarship and a large hunger, to understand a language that had always fascinated her, since she was a child, listening to her grandmother's old opera records. She had studied translation at the University of Florence, had worked afterward for 2 years at a small publishing house translating Italian novels into English, had lived and breathed and dreamed in Italian long before she had ever met Alessandro Moretti Vance at a charity gala in New York 8 months earlier. She had never told his family this. Alessandro knew, of course, but it had never come up in conversation with the rest of them, mostly because none of them had ever asked her a single question about her life. They had decided who she was before she arrived, and nothing she might have said would have changed their minds, so she had simply let them believe what they wanted to believe. Tonight, though, sitting at this long table while they spoke about her as if she were a piece of art hung slightly crooked, something in Claire began to shift. She kept eating. She kept smiling. But she was listening now, listening carefully, letting every word land and settle and take its proper shape in her mind. "She does not even know what to do with the fish fork," Isabella murmured to her friend, watching as Claire set down her utensil after the second course. Claire had, in fact, used the correct fork. She simply did not correct the comment, only glanced up briefly, with an expression that gave nothing away. "Do you think she understands anything we are saying?" Renata asked Vittoria quietly, her eyes flicking toward Claire. "Americans rarely bother to learn other languages," Vittoria replied, not lowering her voice nearly as much as she believed she was. "Why would she be different? Alessandro will grow tired of her within a year. Mark my words." Claire's fork paused for half a second over her plate, then she continued eating. Alessandro, deep in conversation with his uncle about the family's vineyard business, had no idea what was being said further down the table. He glanced over occasionally, catching Claire's eye, offering a small, reassuring smile, unaware of the current running beneath the surface of the evening. The meal continued. More wine was poured. The conversations grew louder, looser, and crueler, the way conversations do when people believe they cannot be understood. Isabella grew bolder with each glass, making comments about Claire's dress, her hair, her obvious lack of breeding, always followed by that soft laugh that seemed designed to cut without leaving a visible mark. Claire sat through all of it. Her face remained calm, her posture remained perfect, but inside, something was building, quiet and steady, like water rising slowly behind a dam that had not yet been tested. She thought about her mother back in Ohio, a woman who had worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on and had never once complained about it in front of her children. She thought about the years she had spent in Florence, sitting in tiny cafes with a dictionary and a notebook, teaching herself to think in a new language until it no longer felt foreign at all. She thought about every person who had ever underestimated her, and how, every single time, she had let their assumptions become her advantage. She had not planned to say anything tonight. She had told herself she would simply endure the evening, smile through it, and let Alessandro handle his own family in his own time. But as the dinner wore on, as the comments grew sharper and the laughter grew louder, Claire began to feel less like enduring and more like waiting. Near the end of the main course, Vittoria set down her wine glass and looked directly at Claire for the first time all evening, her expression carrying the particular confidence of someone who believes they are speaking in a private code. "Isabella," Vittoria said, still looking at Claire but speaking to her niece, "ask our guest if she understood a single word we have said tonight. I am curious to see her face." Isabella smiled, delighted by the request, and turned toward Claire with the practiced sweetness of someone about to deliver an insult wrapped in a bow. She switched into Italian, her tone light and mocking, clearly assuming the words would land as meaningless sound. "Claire, cara," she said, her smile widening, "capisci qualcosa di quello che abbiamo detto stasera? O sei venuta qui solo per il vino gratis?" The table went quiet for a moment, several relatives smiling in anticipation of Claire's blank, confused expression. Claire set down her wineglass. She folded her hands gently on the table, took a slow breath, and looked directly at Isabella. The room was about to learn something none of them had bothered to ask. Alessandro, catching the sudden shift in the air, turned his attention away from his uncle for the first time in several minutes. Something in Claire's posture had changed. She was no longer the quiet, smiling guest sitting politely at the edge of the conversation. Her spine had straightened, her eyes had sharpened. She looked, for just a moment, like a different woman entirely, someone who had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment to arrive. The candles flickered along the table. Somewhere in the kitchen, a server dropped a spoon, the small clatter the only sound besides the low hum of conversation dying away, as more and more relatives noticed the stillness settling over Claire. Vittoria's smile remained fixed in place, though something flickered behind her eyes, an instinct perhaps, a small warning she did not yet understand. Isabella leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, waiting for the joke to land the way it always did. Claire opened her mouth. And when she spoke, the words came out smooth, precise, and utterly fluent, each syllable shaped with the confidence of someone who had spent years falling in love with a language until it became a part of her. The fork Isabella had been holding slipped from her fingers and clattered against the plate. Silence spread across the table like spilled wine, dark and unstoppable, moving from one shocked face to the next, until it reached Vittoria, at the head of the table, whose expression had gone from amusement to something far colder, far more uncertain. Alessandro stared at Claire, his lips parting slightly, astonishment written plainly across his face. In 8 months of knowing her, she had never once mentioned this. He had fallen in love with a woman he thought he understood completely, and in this single moment, in this single dining room, he realized there was an entire part of her life he had never known existed. Claire held Isabella's gaze without blinking, her voice steady, her expression calm, betraying not a single trace of anger, even as the words she had just spoken hung in the air, like a verdict waiting to be read aloud. The evening that had begun with quiet mockery was about to become something none of them would ever forget. Claire's voice moved through the dining room slowly, each word landing like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples out toward every stunned face at the table. She repeated back, almost word for word, the question Isabella had just asked her, the very same question meant to humiliate her in front of an entire family. "You asked me if I understood anything you said tonight," Claire continued, switching smoothly into English so there could be no mistake about what had just happened, no room for anyone to pretend otherwise later. Or, if I only came here for the free wine. Isabella's face drained of color. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again without a single sound coming out. "I understood every word," Claire said, her tone calm, almost gentle, the kind of gentleness that somehow cut deeper than anger ever could. "I understood when you called me poor. I understood when you said I did not know which fork to use, even though I used the correct one every single time. I understood when your aunt said I would not last a year with Alessandro." Vittoria's wineglass sat untouched in front of her, her hand frozen halfway to picking it up. Her eyes, usually so composed, so controlled, now carried something close to panic. "Claire," Alessandro said softly, reaching for her hand under the table, though whether to comfort her or steady himself was not entirely clear. She turned to him, and her expression softened immediately, the hard edge disappearing as quickly as it had arrived. "I am fine," she said quietly, squeezing his hand back. "I only wanted your family to know the truth before this went any further." Great-uncle Paolo, who had smiled kindly at Claire all evening, without understanding what was happening around him, now looked between the faces at the table, with growing confusion, sensing that something significant had shifted, but not entirely certain what. "I studied in Florence for 3 years," Claire said, addressing the whole table now, her voice carrying easily across the long stretch of white tablecloth and candlelight. "I studied translation at the university there. I lived above a small bakery on a narrow street near the Arno River, and every morning I woke up to the smell of fresh bread and the sound of Italian being spoken in the market below my window. I fell in love with this language long before I ever met your son." Renata, seated near Vittoria, had gone very still, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as though bracing for something. "I never hid this from you because I was trying to trick anyone," Claire continued. I simply never had the chance to tell you, because nobody asked. Not once tonight did anyone ask me a single question about myself. Not where I grew up, not what I studied, not what I do for work, not what I love. You decided who I was before I walked through your door, and you have spent this entire evening speaking about me as though I could not hear you, because you assumed I would not understand. The room remained silent. Somewhere near the kitchen doorway, a young server stood frozen, with a tray of dessert plates, unsure whether to enter the dining room or retreat quietly back through the doors. Isabella finally found her voice, though it came out smaller than her earlier mockery had been. I did not mean anything cruel by it, she said, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. You called me Poverina, Claire said, turning to face her directly. Little poor thing, you said it while looking directly at me, smiling, as though I were a stray animal that had wandered into the wrong house. I understood that too. Isabella's cheeks flushed a deep red. She looked down at her plate, unable to meet Claire's steady gaze any longer. Vittoria cleared her throat, attempting to reclaim some measure of control over a table that had entirely slipped from her grasp. Claire, she said, her voice carrying a stiffness that had not been there before. I am sure there has been some misunderstanding tonight. There has been no misunderstanding at all, Claire replied, her tone still calm, still measured, though there was steel beneath it now that had not been present before. I understood perfectly, every word. Alessandro stood slowly from his chair, the scrape of wood against stone floor, unusually loud, in the silence that had fallen over the room. He looked at his mother, then at Isabella, then let his gaze travel slowly around the table at each relative who had spoken carelessly that evening, believing themselves safe behind a language barrier that had never actually existed. I did not know, he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. Then, louder, addressing the table directly, I did not know any of this was happening while I sat at the other end of this table discussing wine exports. It does not matter now, Claire said gently, placing her hand on his arm to guide him back into his seat. What matters is that everyone here understands the truth going forward. But Alessandro did not sit. He remained standing, his jaw tight, his eyes moving from face to face around the table, taking in the discomfort, the shame, the slowly dawning realization, spreading through his relatives, like a fever, finally breaking. Great-uncle Paolo, still slightly behind the rest of the room, leaned toward the cousin beside him and asked quietly what exactly had just happened. The cousin whispered an explanation, and Paolo's eyebrows rose slowly as understanding arrived. He looked at Claire with an entirely new kind of respect, one that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with genuine admiration. She speaks better Italian than half of you, Paolo said suddenly, breaking the tension with a short, surprised laugh. Better than you, Isabella, and you were raised speaking it. A few relatives who had said little all evening exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly relieved they had stayed quiet during the earlier conversation, grateful their own words had not been among those Claire had understood and remembered so precisely. Vittoria sat rigid at the head of the table, her composure cracking at the edges for the first time all evening. She had built her entire reputation within this family on being the sharpest, most observant woman in any room, the one who noticed everything and missed nothing. Tonight, she had missed the most important thing of all, and everyone at the table had witnessed her mistake unfold in real time. I think, Vittoria said slowly, choosing her words with visible care now, that we should perhaps discuss this matter privately, rather than in front of the entire family. There is nothing private about what was said tonight, Claire replied. It was said openly, in front of everyone, with the assumption that I would never understand it. I think it is only fair that the correction happened just as openly. A younger cousin near the far end of the table, a woman named Beatrice who had said little throughout the meal, beyond polite small talk, suddenly spoke up. I think she is right, Beatrice said quietly, though her voice carried clearly in the silence. We were unkind tonight, and we deserve to hear that plainly. Isabella shot Beatrice a sharp look, but Beatrice did not back down, holding Claire's gaze instead, with something that looked almost like respect. The dessert course arrived, carried in by nervous servers who clearly sensed the tension thick in the air, but had no choice but to complete their duties regardless. Plates were set down with careful, quiet movements, forks placed beside them, without the usual light chatter that typically accompanied such moments. Claire looked down at the dessert in front of her, a delicate pastry dusted with powdered sugar, and found she had lost her appetite entirely. The adrenaline that had carried her through the last several minutes was beginning to fade, leaving behind something quieter and more uncertain underneath. Alessandro finally sat back down, though his posture remained tense, his hand finding Claire's beneath the table once more. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, leaning close so only she could hear. "I will be," Claire said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier steadiness. The confrontation had taken more out of her than she wanted to admit, even to herself. Vittoria rose from her seat abruptly, murmuring something about checking on the kitchen staff, though everyone at the table understood this was simply an excuse to leave the room and gather herself away from prying eyes. Her footsteps echoed down the long hallway, quick and uneven, nothing like her usual composed stride. Isabella remained seated, staring down at her dessert without touching it, her earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by something that looked uncomfortably close to shame. The rest of the dinner continued in a strange, subdued quiet, none of the earlier laughter returning, none of the easy conversation resuming. Relatives spoke in low, careful tones, occasionally glancing toward Claire with expressions that ranged from embarrassment to grudging respect, to open curiosity about this woman they had so badly misjudged. When the meal finally ended, Claire excused herself to the terrace for a moment of air, needing distance from the weight of so many eyes still lingering on her. Alessandro followed, finding her standing at the stone railing, looking out over the dark vineyard rows stretching toward the horizon. "I did not plan that," Claire admitted quietly, without turning around. "I told myself I would simply get through tonight quietly. But something in me could not stay silent any longer." "I am glad you did not stay silent," Alessandro said, coming to stand beside her. "I should have protected you from this. I should have paid closer attention to what was happening at that table." "You did not know," Claire said. "None of them expected me to understand. That was the entire point of speaking that way." Alessandro was quiet for a long moment, watching the wind move gently through the vines below them. "My family has always been proud," he said finally. "Sometimes that pride becomes something uglier than it should. Tonight, I think many of them finally saw that clearly." Claire turned to look at him, and for the first time since arriving at the villa, she felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she had been carrying, without fully realizing its weight. "I am not trying to win a war with your family," she said. "I only wanted the truth to be known." "The truth has been known now," Alessandro said, taking her hand in both of his. "And nothing about it changes how I feel about you. If anything, tonight only confirmed what I already believed. You are stronger than any of them realized." Behind them, through the tall glass doors leading back into the villa, the sound of quiet, uncertain conversation continued among the relatives still seated at the table, each of them now forced to reckon with an evening that had not gone at all the way they had expected, and a woman they had badly, badly underestimated. The morning after the dinner, Claire woke in the guest room of the villa to sunlight pouring through tall windows and the distant sound of birds moving through the vineyard outside. For a moment, lying there in the unfamiliar bed, she almost forgot the events of the night before. Then the memory returned in full, and her stomach tightened at the thought of facing the family again over breakfast. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple blue dress, and made her way down the wide staircase toward the sound of quiet voices coming from the terrace where breakfast was being served. She paused at the doorway, gathering herself before stepping outside. The terrace overlooked the vineyard, long tables set with fresh bread, fruit, and coffee, the morning air still cool and carrying the scent of blooming jasmine from the garden below. Several relatives were already seated, speaking in hushed tones that stopped the moment they noticed Claire standing there. "Good morning," Claire said, keeping her voice light despite the awkward silence that had greeted her arrival. A few relatives murmured polite greetings back, though none carried the warmth Claire might have hoped for. Beatrice, the young cousin who had spoken up in Claire's defense the night before, offered her a genuine smile and gestured to the empty seat beside her. "Please, join us," Beatrice said. "There is fresh bread, and the coffee is very good this morning." Claire took the offered seat gratefully, relieved to have at least one person at the table who did not seem to be silently reassessing her entire existence. "I wanted to say," Beatrice continued quietly, once Claire had settled in, "that what happened last night was long overdue. My family can be very difficult about outsiders. I have seen it before, though never quite so directly confronted. Has this happened to others? Claire asked, curious despite herself. Beatrice nodded slowly. My brother married a woman from Spain several years ago. The family was unkind to her as well, though she did not speak Italian and never knew the extent of what was said about her. She left him within 2 years. I have always wondered if things might have been different had someone stood up for her the way you stood up for yourself last night. Claire absorbed this quietly, feeling a mixture of sadness for the unnamed woman and a renewed sense that her decision to speak up the night before had mattered more than she initially realized. Across the terrace, Isabella appeared through the doorway, looking considerably less composed than she had the night before. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, suggesting she had not slept well, and she hesitated at the threshold before finally stepping outside. The terrace grew quiet again as Isabella made her way to an empty chair near the far end of the table, as far from Claire as the seating allowed. She poured herself coffee without meeting anyone's gaze, her movements stiff and careful. Claire watched her for a moment, uncertain how to feel. Part of her wanted to hold on to the anger from the night before, to let Isabella sit in the discomfort of her own making. But another part of her, the part that had grown up watching her mother forgive difficult people again and again, because holding grudges cost more energy than it was worth, felt a small pull toward something gentler. She did not act on it yet. The wound from the night before was still too fresh, the memory of that laughter still too sharp in her mind. Alessandro arrived a few minutes later, dressed casually, his hair still damp from a shower. He crossed the terrace directly to Claire, kissing the top of her head before taking the seat beside her. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. "Better than I expected," Claire admitted, though I woke up several times remembering last night. Alessandro's expression grew serious. "I spoke with my mother this morning, before breakfast." Claire set down her coffee cup, giving him her full attention. "And?" "She is embarrassed," Alessandro said carefully. "More embarrassed than I have ever seen her. My mother does not like being wrong, and last night she was very wrong, in front of the entire family. I think it will take her some time to know how to move forward from that." "I do not need her to grovel," Claire said. "I only needed her to understand that the way she treated me was wrong." "I believe she understands that now," Alessandro said. "Whether she knows how to say so out loud is a different matter entirely." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Contessa Vittoria herself, stepping out onto the terrace with a composure that seemed almost too deliberate, too carefully constructed, as though she had spent the morning rehearsing exactly how to hold her shoulders and set her expression before facing everyone again. The terrace fell silent once more. Vittoria's eyes swept across the table before landing on Claire, and for a moment, something uncertain flickered across her face before the familiar coolness settled back into place. "Good morning," Vittoria said, her voice measured, betraying none of the turmoil Alessandro had described moments earlier. "Good morning," Claire replied evenly, refusing to look away first. Vittoria took her seat at the head of the table, and breakfast continued, in an atmosphere that remained noticeably subdued, compared to the usual liveliness that apparently characterized family gatherings at the villa. Conversation stayed quiet, careful, several relatives clearly still processing the events of the previous evening, and uncertain how to behave around the woman who had so thoroughly upended their assumptions. After breakfast, Claire found herself walking alone through the villa's expansive gardens, needing space to think away from the weight of so many watchful eyes. The gardens stretched behind the main house in careful rows of rose bushes and ancient olive trees, paths of white gravel winding between them, toward a small stone fountain at the center. She sat on a bench near the fountain, listening to the gentle sound of water trickling over old stone, and allowed herself finally to process everything that had happened. The anger from the night before had settled into something quieter now, something closer to exhaustion, mixed with a strange, unexpected pride. She had done what she needed to do. She had told the truth, and she had done it without raising her voice, without losing her composure, without becoming the very thing they had accused her of being. Footsteps on the gravel path interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see Isabella approaching slowly, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression uncertain. "May I sit?" Isabella asked, gesturing to the empty space on the bench beside Claire. Claire considered refusing. Part of her still wanted to, but she nodded instead, sliding slightly to make room. They sat in silence for a long moment. the only sound the gentle trickle of the fountain nearby. "I owe you an apology," Isabella said finally, her voice quieter than Claire had heard it since arriving. "A real one. Not the kind I attempted at dinner last night, which I know now was not enough." Claire remained quiet, waiting to hear more before responding. "I have spent my whole life in this family," Isabella continued. "Being cruel to outsiders was something I learned before I even understood what I was doing. It was simply how things were done here. Nobody ever questioned it, because nobody who did not belong ever understood enough to push back. Until last night," Claire said quietly. "Until last night," Isabella agreed. "I have been thinking about it all morning, about how it must have felt, sitting there, listening to all of us mock you, believing we could say anything at all, because you would never understand a word of it." She paused, shaking her head slowly. "I am ashamed of myself. Genuinely ashamed." Claire studied her for a long moment, searching for any trace of insincerity in her expression, and finding none. "Thank you for saying that," she said finally. "It means something, even if it does not erase what happened." "I know it does not erase it," Isabella said. "I only hope it is a beginning." They sat together a while longer, the conversation slowly softening into something less guarded, Isabella asking careful questions about Claire's time in Florence, genuinely curious now, rather than dismissive, and Claire answering honestly, feeling the tight knot of anger in her chest begin to loosen just slightly. It was not forgiveness yet. Not entirely. But it was a start. And Claire understood that starts mattered, even when they arrived a day too late to prevent the damage already done. As the sun rose higher over the vineyard, casting long shadows across the garden paths, Claire found herself thinking not about the cruelty of the night before, but about the strange, unexpected path forward that now seemed to be opening in front of her. One conversation, one small act of honesty at a time. 3 days passed at the villa, and with each one, the atmosphere shifted a little further from the tension of that first difficult evening. Claire found herself settling into a rhythm, waking early, walking the garden paths before breakfast, slowly learning the names and faces of relatives who had once seemed like a wall of judgment, and now seemed, gradually, like actual people. Not everyone had softened. Renata remained distant, offering only the barest polite greetings whenever their paths crossed, and several older relatives still regarded Claire with a wary caution, as though waiting to see whether her fluency in Italian was some kind of temporary performance, rather than a genuine part of who she was. But others had changed considerably. Beatrice had become something close to a friend, seeking Claire out each morning to walk with her through the gardens, asking endless questions about Florence and translation work and life in America, genuinely curious in a way that felt refreshing after days of scrutiny. Great Uncle Paolo had taken to greeting Claire each morning with a warm handshake and a joke, usually in Italian now, testing her fluency with increasingly complicated phrases and grinning widely each time she responded without hesitation. Isabella, too, had continued to soften, though the process remained slow and occasionally awkward. She had taken to seeking Claire out for small conversations, asking about wedding plans, about Claire's family back in Ohio, questions that felt genuine rather than performed for an audience. Vittoria remained the largest unresolved piece of the puzzle. She had not repeated the cruelty of that first evening, but neither had she offered anything resembling an apology. Instead, she maintained a careful, distant politeness with Claire, speaking only when necessary, her expression unreadable during the rare moments their paths crossed. On the fourth morning, Alessandro announced that his mother had requested a private meeting with Claire to take place that afternoon in the villa's study. Claire felt her stomach tighten at the news. "Do you know what she wants to discuss?" Claire asked, sitting across from Alessandro at the small breakfast table they had taken to sharing away from the larger family gatherings. "I do not," Alessandro admitted. "She has been unusually quiet about her intentions. I offered to be present, but she specifically requested to speak with you alone." Claire spent the hours before the meeting in a state of low, simmering anxiety, running through possible scenarios in her mind. Perhaps Vittoria intended to apologize privately, away from the eyes of the rest of the family, preserving her pride while still addressing the wrong she had done. Perhaps she intended something else entirely, a renewed attempt to convince Claire she did not belong, delivered this time with more careful precision than the clumsy cruelty of that first dinner. When the appointed hour arrived, Claire made her way to the study. A room lined floor to ceiling with old leather-bound books, a heavy wooden desk positioned near tall windows overlooking the vineyard. Vittoria sat in a high-backed chair near the window and gestured for Claire to take the seat across from her. "Thank you for coming," Vittoria said, her voice carrying none of its usual cool distance, something softer and more uncertain underneath instead. "Of course," Claire replied, settling into the chair, keeping her posture straight, despite the nervousness she felt. For a long moment, Vittoria said nothing, her eyes moving toward the window, toward the vineyard rows stretching toward the horizon. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight Claire had not expected. "I have spent many years protecting this family's reputation," Vittoria began. "Perhaps too many years. My own mother taught me that outsiders could not be trusted with our name, our history, our traditions. I believed her completely, without ever questioning whether her lessons were entirely fair." Claire remained quiet, sensing that Vittoria needed space to work through her thoughts without interruption. "When Alessandro told me he intended to marry an American woman with no title and no connection to our world, I assumed the worst," Vittoria continued. "I assumed you were exactly the kind of person my mother had always warned me about, someone drawn to money and status rather than genuine affection. I did not consider, even for a moment, that I might be wrong." "And now?" Claire asked quietly. Vittoria turned to look at her directly, her expression carrying something Claire had not seen from her before, a kind of vulnerable honesty, entirely absent during their previous encounters. "Now I understand that I was the one who did not belong in that conversation, speaking cruelly about someone I had not bothered to know at all. You have shown more grace this week than I demonstrated in a single evening, and that troubles me deeply, because I always believed grace and dignity belonged to this family by birthright, not to be taught to us by an outsider." The word outsider, spoken now without the sharp edge it had carried before, seemed to land differently between them, more observation than accusation. "I did not come here to prove anything to your family," Claire said carefully. "I came here because I love your son, and because I hoped, foolishly perhaps, that his family might come to know me the way he does." "It was not foolish," Vittoria said. "It was simply optimistic, in a way I have forgotten how to be, somewhere along the way." She paused, folding her hands in her lap. "I would like to ask you something, if you will permit it." "Of course." "How did you learn our language so completely?" Vittoria asked. "Not simply the words, but the feeling underneath them. I have met many foreigners who study Italian for years and never quite capture what you captured in that dining room, speaking as though the language had always belonged to you." Claire considered the question carefully before answering. "I think it is because I did not learn it to check a box or complete a course," she said. "I learned it because I fell in love with it, with the sound of it in the morning market, with the way old women argued about vegetables, with the poetry hidden inside even the simplest conversations. I gave myself completely to it, the way you give yourself completely to anything you truly love." Vittoria was quiet for a long moment, studying Claire with an expression that had shifted entirely from their first meeting, something like genuine respect beginning to take shape where suspicion had once lived. "My son is fortunate," Vittoria said finally, the words coming slowly, as though she had not spoken them in this particular combination before, and needed to test their weight. "I did not see that clearly enough until now." "Thank you," Claire said quietly, feeling something loosen in her chest that had been tight since that first difficult dinner. "I owe you an apology," Vittoria continued, and though the words came stiffly, formally, there was no mistaking the sincerity beneath them. What was said at that table should never have been said, by me or by anyone else in this family. I allowed my own prejudice to shape an entire evening, and I embarrassed not only you, but this family, in ways that will take time to repair." Claire nodded slowly, accepting the apology with the same grace she had carried throughout the difficult week. "Thank you for saying that," she said. "It matters more than you might realize." They sat together for a while longer, the conversation gradually shifting into gentler territory, Vittoria asking careful questions about Claire's family, her work, her hopes for the future with Alessandro. It was not a complete transformation, not yet, but it was a genuine beginning, built on honesty rather than performance. As the meeting drew to a close, Vittoria rose from her chair and extended her hand, this time without the cool hesitation that had marked their first greeting days earlier. Claire took it, and the handshake between them carried a warmth entirely absent from their earlier encounter. "I hope," Victoria said, "that in time, you might come to think of this family as your own, despite the poor beginning we gave you." "I would like that," Claire said honestly, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it completely. Walking back through the villa's long hallway afterward, Claire felt lighter than she had since arriving days earlier, the weight of that first cruel evening finally beginning to lift, replaced by something more hopeful, something that felt, for the first time, like the genuine possibility of belonging. Word of what had happened at the villa spread quickly through the wider circle of family friends and distant relatives who had not been present that first evening, but heard the story secondhand within days. By the time Claire and Alessandro attended a smaller gathering hosted by one of Vittoria's oldest friends the following week, it was clear the story had traveled well beyond the dining room where it began. The gathering took place at a smaller estate, an hour from the villa, owned by a family friend named Contessa Livia, a woman known throughout the region for hosting elegant, closely watched social events, where reputations could rise or fall, based on a single evening's impression. Claire understood, walking through the entrance with Alessandro at her side, that this gathering would serve as something of a test, an opportunity for the wider circle to see for themselves whether the story they had heard was true. Livia greeted them warmly at the door, her sharp eyes moving over Claire with obvious curiosity. "So you are the young woman everyone has been discussing," Livia said, switching easily into Italian, watching closely for Claire's reaction. "I have heard the stories reach quite far," Claire replied in the same language, her tone light, her accent smooth and unhesitating. Livia's eyebrows rose with evident delight. "Wonderful," she said, clapping her hands together once. "I was told you spoke beautifully, but hearing it directly is an entirely different experience. Please, come in, come in." The gathering unfolded across several elegant rooms, guests moving between conversations, with drinks in hand, the atmosphere considerably lighter than the tense dinner at the villa days earlier. Claire found herself the subject of curious glances throughout the evening, though the curiosity now carried a different quality entirely. Admiration rather than judgment, interest rather than dismissal. Several guests approached her directly throughout the evening, eager to test the story for themselves, asking questions in rapid Italian, clearly hoping to catch her fluency faltering under pressure. Claire answered each question smoothly, occasionally correcting a guest's grammar with gentle humor that left them laughing rather than offended. And slowly, throughout the evening, her reputation among this wider circle began to take a very different shape than the one Vittoria's earlier cruelty had originally intended to create. Isabella, present at the gathering as well, watched these exchanges with an expression that had shifted considerably from the mockery of that first dinner. She found herself, at one point during the evening, actually defending Claire to a distant cousin who had not been present at the original dinner and seemed inclined to repeat some of the old assumptions about American brides marrying into Italian families for status, rather than genuine affection. "You have not met her properly," Isabella said firmly, surprising even herself with the conviction in her voice. "She speaks our language more beautifully than most of us who were born into it, and she has more grace than anyone I know." The distant cousin, taken aback by Isabella's unexpected defense, said nothing further on the matter for the remainder of the evening. Alessandro, watching this exchange from across the room, caught Claire's eye and offered a small, knowing smile. Later, as they stood together near the terrace doors overlooking Livia's gardens, he mentioned what he had witnessed. "Isabella defended you tonight," he said quietly, "to someone who did not even know she had once mocked you herself." "People can change," Claire said simply. "Sometimes, all they need is a reason to look at things differently." "You gave her that reason," Alessandro said, "even after everything she said that first night." Claire considered this for a moment before responding. "I think everyone deserves the chance to become better than their worst moment," she said. "I do not know if I would have believed that as strongly before meeting your family, but I believe it now." The evening continued pleasantly, conversations flowing easily between guests, laughter rising and falling naturally throughout the elegant rooms. Claire found herself increasingly at ease, no longer bracing for the sharp edge of unexpected cruelty that had defined her first evening among these people. Near the end of the gathering, Livia pulled Claire aside for a quiet conversation near a window overlooking the darkened gardens outside. "I want to tell you something," Livia said, her earlier playful curiosity replaced by something more serious. I have known Vittoria for over 30 years. She is a proud woman, sometimes to a fault, and I have watched her make similar mistakes with others, who married into families within our circle. Rarely, if ever, have I seen anyone respond the way you did that evening. I only spoke honestly, Claire said. Honesty is rarer than you might think, especially delivered with the calm you apparently managed, Livia replied. Most people, faced with that kind of cruelty, either collapse entirely or lash out in anger that only confirms whatever unkind assumptions were already being made about them. You did neither. You simply told the truth and let the weight of it fall where it belonged. Claire absorbed this quietly, grateful for the unexpected validation from someone entirely outside the immediate family, someone with no personal stake in how the story concluded. Vittoria has spoken of you with genuine respect since that evening, Livia continued. I have known her a very long time, and I have rarely heard her speak that way about anyone, let alone someone she initially dismissed so completely. The words settled warmly in Claire's chest, a confirmation of the private conversation she had shared with Vittoria days earlier, evidence that the shift she had witnessed was genuine, rather than merely performed for her benefit. As the gathering drew to a close, and guests began departing into the cool evening air, Claire found herself reflecting on how quickly circumstances could shift when honesty was allowed room to breathe. A week earlier, she had sat silently through an evening of quiet cruelty, uncertain whether she belonged anywhere near this family or their world. Tonight, she had stood confidently among strangers who had heard her story secondhand and had come, many of them, already prepared to respect rather than dismiss her. Driving back toward the villa later that evening, Alessandro reached over and took her hand, his expression thoughtful in the dim light of the car's interior. I have been thinking, he said quietly, about how different tonight felt compared to that first dinner. So have I, Claire admitted. I am proud of you, Alessandro said. Not simply for what you said that first night, though that took a courage I am not certain I possess myself. I am proud of how you have carried yourself every day since, extending grace to people who did not initially deserve it, giving my family the chance to become better than their worst behavior. Claire smiled softly, watching the dark countryside slip past the car windows. I did not do it entirely for them, she admitted. I did it because I did not want to become someone shaped by their cruelty. I wanted to remain exactly who I was before I ever walked through your family's door. You succeeded, Alessandro said. More completely than I think even you realize. The car continued through the darkness toward the villa, past vineyards, silvered under moonlight, carrying two people who had begun this journey, uncertain of what awaited them, and were discovering, gradually, that the path forward might hold more warmth than either had initially dared to hope. 2 weeks after the gathering at Contessa Livia's estate, Claire received an unexpected phone call from her mother back in Ohio, asking careful questions about how the family in Italy had received her. Claire found herself sitting on the small balcony outside her guest room, phone pressed to her ear, trying to explain the strange, complicated journey of the past several weeks. They were unkind at first, Claire admitted honestly, unwilling to hide the truth from her mother, the way she had briefly considered doing to spare her worry. Very unkind, actually, but things have changed since then. Unkind how? Her mother asked, concern immediately sharpening her voice. Claire explained the events of that first dinner carefully, watching the sun set slowly over the vineyard as she spoke. Her mother listened quietly, occasionally asking clarifying questions, her voice growing tighter with each new detail Claire revealed. I raised you better than to let people speak to you that way, her mother said finally, once Claire had finished the story. I hope you told them exactly what you thought. Claire laughed softly, the sound carrying easily across the quiet evening air. I did, actually, in fluent Italian, which none of them expected. Her mother's surprised laughter came through the phone, warm and genuine. Well, I suppose those years in Florence finally paid off, in a way I never imagined they would. They certainly did, Claire agreed. And how are things now? Her mother asked, her concern gradually softening into curiosity. Better, Claire said honestly. Much better than I expected, actually. Alessandro's mother apologized privately, and several of the relatives who were unkind that first night have become genuinely kind since. Not everyone has changed completely. but enough have that I feel like I actually belong here now, rather than simply being tolerated. I am proud of you, her mother said quietly. You have always had more strength than you realized, even as a little girl. The conversation continued for a while longer, drifting into easier topics, wedding plans and family updates, the comfortable rhythm of a mother and daughter catching up across an ocean's distance. When the call finally ended, Claire remained on the balcony a while longer, watching the last light fade from the sky, feeling grateful for the family waiting for her back home, even as she slowly built new connections here. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor to the villa. Claire was having coffee on the terrace with Beatrice when a car pulled through the gates, delivering a woman Claire did not immediately recognize, elegant and reserved, carrying herself with the same aristocratic bearing that seemed to run through this entire family. That is my Aunt Francesca, Beatrice explained quietly, watching the woman approach the villa entrance. She rarely visits. She lives mostly in Milan now, and has always kept her distance from family gatherings since her own difficult marriage, years ago. Difficult marriage? Claire asked, curious despite herself. Beatrice lowered her voice further. She married outside the family's expectations as well, many years before you. A businessman, with no title, someone my grandmother considered entirely unsuitable. The family treated her terribly during those early years, much the way they treated you initially, though she did not have your advantage of understanding everything that was said behind her back. Claire absorbed this information with growing interest, watching as Francesca made her way toward the terrace where breakfast was being served. What happened to her marriage? Claire asked. She left him eventually, Beatrice said quietly, after years of feeling like an outsider in her own family, unable to bear the constant judgment any longer. I believe she has regretted it since, though she rarely speaks of it. When Francesca joined them on the terrace moments later, her sharp eyes immediately found Claire, studying her with an intensity that felt different from the earlier scrutiny Claire had grown accustomed to from other relatives. You must be Claire, Francesca said, taking the seat across from her. I have heard quite a lot about you since arriving this morning. All good things, I hope, Claire said, offering a careful smile. Mostly, Francesca replied honestly, though I understand the beginning was considerably rougher than what people are describing now. Claire nodded, uncertain how much detail to share with this new relative she had only just met. I want you to know something, Francesca continued, her voice softening slightly. I faced something similar many years ago, when I married outside what this family considered acceptable. I did not have your fluency, your ability to understand and confront what was being said about me. I simply endured it silently for years, until the silence became unbearable, and I finally left. I am sorry that happened to you, Claire said gently. I am not looking for sympathy, Francesca said, though her tone carried no sharpness. I am telling you this because I want you to understand something important. What you did that first evening, standing up for yourself immediately, rather than allowing years of quiet resentment to build, was braver than anything I managed during my own marriage. I let their cruelty win, eventually, by leaving rather than fighting for my place within this family. You refused to do the same. Claire felt a lump forming in her throat, moved by the vulnerability in Francesca's admission. I do not think leaving was a failure, she said carefully. Sometimes walking away is its own form of strength. Perhaps, Francesca said, though I have often wondered, over the years, what might have happened had I confronted them the way you did, rather than allowing their judgment to convince me I did not belong. The conversation shifted into gentler territory after that, Francesca asking curious questions about Claire's life, her work, her relationship with Alessandro, gradually revealing herself to be warmer and more open than her initial reserved arrival had suggested. As the morning wore on and other relatives joined them on the terrace, Claire found herself reflecting on the larger pattern Francesca's story had revealed. This family's cruelty toward outsiders was not new, not something invented specifically for her benefit. It was a pattern stretching back generations, one that had cost the family relationships and connections they might otherwise have cherished, had pride not gotten in the way so consistently. Perhaps, Claire thought, watching Francesca laugh softly at something Beatrice had said, her own willingness to confront that cruelty directly, rather than simply enduring it silently, might create space for something different going forward, not just for herself, but for anyone else who might one day marry, into this complicated, proud family, and face the same unfair judgment she had faced weeks earlier. Later that afternoon, walking alone through the vineyard rows with Alessandro, Claire shared what she had learned from Francesca's visit. "I never knew that story," Alessandro admitted, clearly troubled by the revelation. "She left before I was old enough to understand what had happened. I only remember my mother speaking of her occasionally, always with a certain disapproval I never fully understood." "Your family has a pattern," Claire said gently. "Toward outsiders, I mean. It goes back further than just me." Alessandro was quiet for a long moment, considering this. "I think," he said finally, "that pattern needs to end. Not just for you, but for anyone who comes into this family in the future, married to someone they love, deserving of the same welcome my mother would want extended to her own children." Claire squeezed his hand, grateful for his willingness to see clearly what his family had struggled to acknowledge for generations. "Change takes time," she said, "but I think it has already begun." They continued walking together through the late afternoon light, the vineyard stretching endlessly around them, carrying between them a quiet determination that whatever pattern had shaped this family's treatment of outsiders in the past would not continue unchallenged into the future they were building together. As the wedding date drew closer, the planning for the ceremony began in earnest, and with it came a fresh set of challenges Claire had not entirely anticipated. The wedding would be held at the villa itself, a grand affair befitting the family's standing, and the guest list stretched into the hundreds, filled with names Claire did not recognize, and titles she was still learning to navigate correctly. Vittoria, in the weeks following their private conversation in the study, had gradually taken on a more active role in helping Claire prepare, though the relationship between them remained something still finding its proper shape, careful and evolving, rather than fully settled. One afternoon, several weeks before the ceremony, Vittoria invited Claire into the villa's formal sitting room to discuss the guest list and seating arrangements, a task that required delicate knowledge of decades of family alliances and old rivalries that Claire had no way of understanding on her own. "This will require patience," Vittoria warned, settling into her chair with a thick folder of names and notes. "Some of these families have not spoken to each other in years, over disputes so old that most of us have forgotten how they began." Claire smiled, appreciating the dry humor beginning to emerge more frequently in Vittoria's conversations with her. "I trust your judgment on this," she said. "You know this world far better than I do." They worked through the afternoon together, Vittoria explaining old family histories and Claire asking careful questions, gradually building not just a seating chart, but something resembling genuine collaboration between them, two women working toward a shared goal rather than circling each other with suspicion. "I have been thinking," Vittoria said at one point, setting down her pen, "about something I would like to propose, if you are open to it." "Of course," Claire said, curious. "I would like you to say a few words in Italian during the ceremony," Vittoria said. "Not simply your vows, which I understand you have already prepared with Alessandro. I mean something more, an acknowledgement to the wider family and guests, spoken in the language you fought so hard to claim as your own that first evening here." Claire considered the proposal carefully. "Why do you think that is important?" she asked. "Because," Vittoria said, "many of the guests who will attend this wedding were present, in one way or another, when word spread of what happened that first dinner. Some heard exaggerated versions, others heard the truth, but nearly everyone has formed some opinion about you before ever meeting you directly. I think it would mean something, for you to stand before all of them and speak in a language that is not simply learned, but genuinely loved, exactly as you described to me weeks ago." Claire felt a warmth spreading through her chest at the suggestion, recognizing it for what it was, an olive branch extended not simply between herself and Vittoria, but between herself and the wider family circle that had once dismissed her so completely. "I would like that," Claire said finally. "Very much." The weeks that followed brought a flurry of preparation, dress fittings, and menu tastings, and careful negotiations over flowers and music, each detail bringing Claire closer into the fabric of a family she had once feared would never fully accept her. Isabella, in particular, threw herself into the preparations with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, taking charge of coordinating with local vendors and offering suggestions that reflected a genuine desire to see the wedding succeed beautifully. "I want to make up for how I behaved," Isabella admitted one afternoon, as she and Claire reviewed flower arrangements together in the villa's kitchen. I know planning a wedding does not erase what I said that first night, but I want you to know, I am trying. I can see that you are trying, Claire said honestly. And it matters. Great-uncle Paolo, meanwhile, had appointed himself Claire's unofficial Italian tutor for the ceremony speech, meeting with her several evenings a week to help polish her wording, correcting small grammatical details with the patient enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed the process. You already speak better than most people born here, Paolo told her one evening, reviewing her draft speech with careful attention. But a wedding speech deserves special care. Every word should feel like a gift to the people listening. Claire took his advice seriously, spending hours refining her words, wanting the speech to reflect not simply gratitude for the wedding itself, but the genuine journey she had traveled since that first difficult evening, the gradual transformation from outsider to something closer to belonging. As the wedding day approached, Claire found herself reflecting often on how differently things had turned out compared to her fears during that first car ride through the villa's iron gates weeks earlier. She had arrived expecting judgment and had received, eventually, something far more valuable, a family willing to confront its own worst tendencies and grow beyond them. Not everyone had transformed completely. Renata remained politely distant, never quite warming despite the passage of weeks, and a handful of older relatives still regarded Claire with a caution that seemed unlikely to fully disappear. But the majority of the family had shifted meaningfully, and the shift felt genuine rather than performed, built on the foundation of that first honest confrontation rather than despite it. The night before the wedding, Claire sat with Alessandro on the terrace overlooking the vineyard, both of them quiet, absorbing the weight of the day that awaited them. Do you remember, Alessandro said softly, how frightened you were that first evening, walking through the gates? I remember every detail, Claire said. I do not think I will ever forget it. Tomorrow, Alessandro said, you will stand in that same house, surrounded by many of the same people, and instead of enduring their cruelty in silence, you will be honored as my wife, speaking words of gratitude in a language you fought to claim as your own. Claire smiled, feeling the weight of the journey settle into something resembling peace. It feels like a strange kind of justice, she admitted. Not the kind I ever imagined seeking, but justice nonetheless. You never sought justice, Alessandro said gently. You simply refused to accept being diminished, and everything that followed grew naturally from that refusal. They sat together in comfortable silence, as the stars emerged slowly over the darkened vineyard, both of them aware that tomorrow would mark not simply the joining of two people, but the quiet, hard-won resolution of a conflict that had begun with cruelty and was ending, improbably, with something close to genuine love extended in every direction. The morning of the wedding arrived bright and clear, sunlight spilling across the vineyard in golden waves, as the villa transformed into something out of a storybook. White chairs lined the garden in careful rows, flowers cascaded from every archway, and the quiet bustle of final preparations filled every corner of the estate. Claire stood in front of the tall mirror in her guest room, watching as the final touches were added to her wedding dress. A woman named Carla, carefully arranging the long train, while Beatrice fussed happily with Claire's hair nearby. You look beautiful, Beatrice said, stepping back to admire her work. Truly beautiful. Claire studied her reflection, hardly recognizing the composed, elegant woman looking back at her. It felt strange to think that only weeks earlier, she had stood nervously in this same house, uncertain whether she would ever feel comfortable within these walls, let alone consider it a place worth calling home. A soft knock came at the door, and Vittoria entered quietly, dressed in an elegant deep blue gown, her expression carrying an emotion Claire had rarely seen from her, something soft and unguarded. May I have a moment alone with Claire? Vittoria asked the others, who quickly excused themselves, leaving the two women together in the quiet room. I wanted to give you something, Vittoria said, holding out a small velvet box. Before the ceremony begins. Claire opened it carefully, finding inside a delicate pair of earrings, clearly old, clearly precious, the kind of heirloom passed down through generations rather than purchased new. These belonged to my grandmother, Vittoria explained. She wore them on her own wedding day, and I wore them on mine. I would like you to wear them today, if you are willing. Claire felt tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes. Vittoria, I do not know what to say. Say nothing, Vittoria said gently. Simply wear them, and know that you are as much a part of this family now as anyone who shares our blood. Claire embraced her carefully, mindful of both their carefully arranged outfits, and felt Vittoria return the embrace with genuine warmth. A far cry from the cold, appraising handshake that had greeted her arrival weeks earlier. Thank you, Claire whispered, for everything. For the apology, for the earrings, for the chance to become part of this family properly. Thank you, Vittoria replied, for refusing to let my worst behavior define what this family could become. You have taught an old woman something important, and I will not forget it. They separated, both women wiping carefully at their eyes to preserve their makeup, sharing a small laugh at the absurdity of nearly ruining hours of preparation with happy tears. The ceremony itself unfolded beautifully in the villa's garden. Rows of guests, seated beneath a canopy of blooming flowers, sunlight filtering gently through the trees overhead. Claire walked down the aisle on the arm of her father, who had flown in from Ohio days earlier, his pride evident in every careful step beside her. Alessandro waited at the end of the aisle, his expression carrying an emotion so raw and genuine that Claire felt her own composure nearly slip entirely before she had even reached him. The ceremony proceeded with quiet elegance, vows exchanged in both English and Italian, the officiant weaving between languages with practiced ease. When the moment came for Claire to address the gathered guests, as she and Vittoria had planned weeks earlier, she stepped forward with a steadiness that surprised even herself, looking out over the sea of faces, many of whom had heard whispered stories about that first difficult dinner, curious now to witness this moment directly. She began speaking in Italian, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet garden, thanking the family for welcoming her, acknowledging the difficult beginning honestly, rather than pretending it had never happened, and expressing gratitude for the genuine transformation she had witnessed in the weeks since. I did not arrive in this family easily, she said, her voice steady and warm. There was cruelty at first, born from assumptions, rather than truth. But I have learned since then that this family is capable of something far greater than that first difficult evening suggested. I have watched people change, watched pride give way to genuine warmth, and I am deeply grateful to stand here today, not simply as Alessandro's wife, but as someone this family has chosen to embrace fully, flaws and history and all. She glanced toward Vittoria, seated in the front row, tears visible on her face despite her efforts to remain composed. I am especially grateful to my new mother, who taught me that even the proudest hearts can learn to bend toward something better. A quiet murmur of emotion rippled through the gathered guests, several relatives wiping at their eyes, moved by the honesty and grace of Claire's words. Isabella, seated near the front, nodded slowly, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. Great-uncle Paolo, beaming with obvious pride at how well his student had delivered her carefully practiced words, clapped enthusiastically the moment Claire finished speaking, starting a wave of applause that spread quickly through the entire garden. The ceremony concluded shortly after, and the celebration that followed carried none of the tension that had marked Claire's earlier visits to the villa. Guests mingled freely, laughter rising easily across the garden, and Claire found herself repeatedly approached by relatives eager to congratulate her, many offering warm words about her speech, several admitting openly how moved they had been by her honesty about the difficult beginning. As evening fell and the celebration continued beneath strings of soft lights hung throughout the garden, Claire stood for a moment near the edge of the terrace, watching the joyful chaos unfold before her, hardly able to reconcile this warm, celebratory scene with the cold, judgmental dinner that had greeted her arrival weeks earlier. Alessandro found her there, wrapping his arms around her from behind, resting his chin gently on her shoulder. "Happy?" he asked quietly. "More than I imagined possible," Claire admitted. "I never expected this family to become something I would genuinely want to belong to." "They are fortunate to have you," Alessandro said. "All of them, myself especially." Claire turned to face him, the lights of the celebration glowing softly around them, and felt, for the first time completely, that she had found not simply a husband, but a genuine home, built not on the foundation of easy acceptance, but on the harder, more valuable foundation of honesty, confronted, and grace, ultimately extended in return. 6 months after the wedding, Claire found herself once again seated at the long dining table in the villa, though this time the atmosphere carried none of the tension that had defined her first evening within these walls. The occasion was a family dinner celebrating the harvest season, a tradition Claire had come to genuinely look forward to since becoming part of the family officially. The table was filled with familiar faces now, people whose names and histories Claire had come to know well over the months since the wedding. Beatrice sat beside her, chatting easily about a trip she was planning to take with her new boyfriend, a young man from Rome who had recently joined the family gatherings and seemed to be receiving a far warmer welcome than Claire had initially experienced herself. "They like him already," Beatrice said, glancing toward the young man in question, currently deep in conversation with great-uncle Paolo near the head of the table. "Though I suspect that has something to do with the lesson this family learned last year." Claire smiled at the observation, recognizing the truth in it. Since that first difficult dinner, the family's treatment of newcomers had shifted noticeably. A quiet but genuine change, rippling through gatherings large and small. New additions to the family, whether through marriage or new relationships, were met now with curiosity rather than suspicion. Questions asked directly, rather than judgments formed in whispered asides. Isabella, seated further down the table, caught Claire's eye and offered a warm smile, one of many small moments of connection that had become routine between them over the past months. Their friendship, born awkwardly from that difficult beginning, had grown into something genuine and lasting, built on the honesty of that first confrontation rather than despite it. Vittoria, presiding over the table with her usual composed elegance, had transformed most visibly of all. Where once she had watched newcomers with narrowed, suspicious eyes, she now approached each new face at the family table with genuine warmth, asking careful questions, extending the kind of welcome she had failed to offer Claire during that first difficult evening. "I have been thinking," Vittoria said during a lull in the evening's conversation, addressing the table generally, "about how much this family has changed over the past year. I do not think any of us fully appreciated, before Claire's arrival, how much unkindness had become woven into our traditions without any of us questioning it." The table grew quiet, several relatives glancing toward Claire with expressions of gratitude and respect that would have seemed impossible during that first tense dinner. "I have made my share of mistakes over the years," Vittoria continued, "but few have taught me as much as that first evening we spent together. Claire, I am grateful, more than I can properly express, that you chose grace over anger, and that your example changed something fundamental about how this family treats those who are new among us." Claire felt a familiar warmth spreading through her chest, gratitude mixed with a quiet pride at how far this family had traveled together since that difficult beginning. "I am grateful too," she said honestly, "for everyone's willingness to grow beyond that first mistake. Not every family would have been capable of that kind of change." The dinner continued pleasantly, conversation flowing easily around the table, laughter rising and falling naturally, without any of the sharp undertones that had once characterized these gatherings. Claire found herself, at one point, teaching a young cousin some English phrases in exchange for practicing a particularly difficult Italian expression she had never quite mastered, the exchange happening naturally, warmly, exactly the kind of cultural bridge she had once hoped might be possible when she first arrived at this villa months earlier. After dinner, as guests began drifting out onto the terrace to enjoy the cool evening air, Claire found herself standing beside Francesca, the aunt who had shared her own difficult history with the family during Claire's earlier visit. "I wanted you to know," Francesca said quietly, "that I have been considering returning to more family gatherings since your wedding. Watching the changes this family has undergone gave me hope that perhaps I might find a place here again, after all these years away." Claire felt genuinely moved by the admission. "I would love to see you here more often," she said. "This family is better with you in it." Francesca smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that Claire had not seen from her during their earlier meeting. "Perhaps," she said, "your courage that first evening created space for more than just your own belonging. Perhaps it created space for all of us, who had once felt pushed to the margins of this family, to find our way back toward the center." The observation stayed with Claire long after the evening ended, as she and Alessandro drove back toward the small house they had recently purchased near the vineyard, close enough to remain connected to the family, but independent enough to build their own life together. "Do you ever think about that first dinner?" Alessandro asked, glancing over at her as they drove through the darkened countryside. Often, Claire admitted, though the memory does not carry the same sting it once did. It feels more like the beginning of something important now, rather than simply a painful moment I had to survive. I think, Alessandro said, that it became the beginning of something important precisely because of how you handled it. Had you simply endured the cruelty silently, nothing would have changed. The family would have continued treating outsiders the same way they always had, and you would have carried that wound quietly for years, the way Francesca did. I only spoke the truth, Claire said. I never intended to change an entire family's behavior. Sometimes, Alessandro said, reaching over to take her hand, the truth, spoken clearly and without malice, changes far more than we ever intended to.
You did not set out to transform my family. You simply refused to accept their cruelty as something you had to endure quietly, and everything else followed naturally from that single choice.
Claire considered this as the car continued through the night, the vineyard rows stretching silver and quiet on either side of the road, thinking about the strange, unexpected journey that had brought her from that first terrifying car ride through the villa's iron gates to this quiet moment, driving home with her husband after an evening spent among people who had become, genuinely and completely, her family. The road ahead curved gently through the darkness, leading toward the small house waiting for them, and Claire felt, more strongly than she had at any point since that first difficult dinner, that she had found exactly where she belonged. A full year after the wedding, the villa prepared once again for a large family gathering, though this time the occasion carried a different kind of significance entirely. Vittoria had decided to host a celebration honoring the family's long history, inviting not just immediate relatives, but distant cousins, old family friends, and several people who had drifted away from regular gatherings over the years, including Francesca, who had indeed returned to more frequent visits since Claire's wedding, exactly as she had hoped. Claire stood in the villa's kitchen that morning, helping coordinate final preparations alongside Isabella and Beatrice, the three of them working together with the easy familiarity of women who had built genuine friendship over the past year, despite their difficult beginning. "Do you realize," Isabella said, arranging flowers into a large centerpiece, "that this is almost exactly 1 year since that first dinner? The one where I behaved so terribly?" I had not thought about the exact timing, Claire admitted, though privately she suspected some part of her had noted the anniversary approaching. "I think it is fitting," Beatrice said, "that we are hosting this larger celebration now, bringing back people who felt pushed away over the years. It feels like healing something that has needed healing for a very long time." The guests began arriving throughout the afternoon, filling the villa's grand rooms and gardens with warmth and laughter, an atmosphere entirely different from the tense formality that had characterized Claire's first visit. Vittoria moved among the guests with genuine warmth, greeting old friends and distant relatives alike with the same welcoming attention she had once reserved only for those she considered worthy of her time. Claire found herself, throughout the afternoon, approached repeatedly by relatives eager to share how much they had heard about her, about the transformation she had inspired within the family, several expressing genuine gratitude for changes they had witnessed in how the family treated newcomers and outsiders in the months since her arrival. Near the end of the afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent toward the vineyard horizon, Vittoria gathered the family together on the terrace for a brief toast, raising her glass with an expression Claire had come to know well over the past year, warm and genuine, entirely different from the cold composure that had greeted her arrival. "A year ago," Vittoria began, addressing the gathered crowd, "this family made a mistake that I am not proud of. We judged someone before we knew her, and we let old prejudices shape an evening that should have been filled with welcome instead." The crowd grew quiet, several relatives glancing toward Claire, who stood beside Alessandro near the terrace railing, feeling the weight of the moment settle gently around her. "That mistake," Vittoria continued, "became, unexpectedly, the beginning of something valuable for this family. Claire showed us, through her grace and her courage, that we had allowed pride and suspicion to close doors that should have remained open. Since that evening, I have watched this family grow into something better than we were before, more welcoming, more curious about the people who join us, rather than immediately suspicious of them." She raised her glass higher, looking directly at Claire with an expression of genuine affection. To Claire, who taught an old, proud family that grace is stronger than cruelty, and honesty is more powerful than silence, and to all of us, who have had the privilege of learning that lesson because of her. The gathered crowd raised their glasses in response, a chorus of warm agreement rippling across the terrace, and Claire felt tears gathering in her eyes, despite her best efforts to maintain her composure. Alessandro squeezed her hand gently, leaning close to whisper in her ear. "You did this," he said quietly. "All of this warmth, all of this change. It began with you." Claire shook her head slightly, unable to fully accept the credit alone. "It began with the willingness of everyone here to grow beyond their worst moment," she said. "I only refused to accept cruelty as something I had to endure silently. Everyone else did the harder work of actually changing." As the toast concluded and conversation resumed across the terrace, Francesca approached Claire quietly, her expression carrying the same warmth that had grown between them since her return to more frequent family visits. "I want to thank you," Francesca said, "for giving this family the chance to become something better than what drove me away all those years ago. I do not know if I would have found my way back here without the changes your courage inspired." "I am glad you came back," Claire said honestly. "This family is better with you here." The celebration continued late into the evening, laughter and music carrying across the darkened vineyard, guests old and new, mingling freely, without the careful, suspicious distance that had once characterized these gatherings. Claire moved among the crowd throughout the night, no longer the nervous outsider who had once feared she would never find acceptance within these walls, but someone genuinely at home, someone whose presence had reshaped, in small but meaningful ways, an entire family's understanding of what welcome truly meant. Later that night, as the last guests departed and the villa grew quiet once more, Claire stood with Alessandro on the terrace, looking out over the darkened vineyard where the celebration had unfolded hours earlier. "1 year ago," Claire said softly, "I walked through those gates, terrified that I would never belong here. And now?" Alessandro asked, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Now," Claire said, leaning into him, "I cannot imagine belonging anywhere else." The stars emerged slowly overhead, scattered across the dark sky above the quiet vineyard, and Claire felt, standing there with her husband, in the place that had once seemed so hostile and now felt entirely like home, that the difficult beginning she had endured had led, improbably and beautifully, to exactly where she was always meant to be. The villa settled into peaceful silence around them, holding within its old stone walls the memory of a single evening's cruelty transformed, over the course of a single remarkable year, into something far more valuable, a family made stronger, not by avoiding its worst mistakes, but by having the courage to confront them honestly and grow beyond them together.